Right, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, picking up in verse 12 here. Ecclesiastes 2, picking up in 12. Prior to this section, Solomon had talked about setting out his heart to seek wisdom back in chapter 1. And he began to list different things. He listed a number of things in the beginning of chapter 2. And of course, the conclusion to all those various aspects of pursuing a life of pleasure, a life of luxury, he says, that's all vanity. There's no ultimate good or fulfillment in those things. Now we're going to jump into 12 through 17, where he takes a deeper look at the idea of wisdom, and then also he mentions folly and madness as well. So let's read here Ecclesiastes 2, 12 through 17. And if I could get a volunteer, Philip.
Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has done, only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this is also vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all its vanity and grasping for the wind.
Okay, so he says, I considered wisdom and folly and madness, going after this wisdom in his life. We mentioned the fact that how wise he was. I want us to read a section out of 1 Kings chapter 4, because it notes these various areas of wisdom that he explored or expounded upon. Let's go to 1 Kings 4 and read verses 29 through 34. 1 Kings 4, 29 to 34. Who will grab that for us? John.
And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. So that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all the other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. And he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his song were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth, who had heard of his wisdom.
Okay. It says there that these kings came. Who else came to see him? We won't read it, but let's recall. Who came to see him?
Queen of Sheba.
Queen of Sheba. And what was her remark or conclusion after she had been there?
I think it was that she had not heard the half of what she saw when she was there.
Right. What's usually the case on things we hear about great feats or tales or stuff like that?
They're exaggerated.
Usually they're exaggerated. You know, people add to them, they embellish them. You know, a lot of writings of Julius Caesar, for instance, they've gone back, they've done research and realized, you know, when he wrote it from his perspective, he exaggerated stuff and he colored stuff to make himself look more favorable as the tale went out. But when the Queen of Sheba went to see Solomon and was there in his presence and saw, you know, his court, so to speak, listened to him expound on various things, that wisdom that he had, she was like, the half of it's not been told. And what we just read in 1 Kings, you know, talks about all these different areas and mostly about the natural areas where he spoke with wisdom concerning these things. So when we read in Ecclesiastes 2 verse 12, And he says, I turned myself to consider wisdom. I went after these things. I went to learn about them, to understand these kinds of things. That is part of what's in the background of it. Knowing about all the things of this world. What kind of other topics, besides the natural elements, let's say, with the animals, the plants, trees, all that kind of stuff, what other things would Solomon have wisdom about?
Yeah, wisdom about human nature.
Okay, and it was hinted at there in what we just read. What was the hint there about human nature, the way people are, the way people behave? Anybody? Said he wrote 3,000 of something. I think it was 3,000. Maybe that was the Psalms, but
3,000 Proverbs and 1,005 Psalms.
okay, 3,000 Proverbs. Right? When we read the book of Proverbs, what do we read about? A lot about human nature and warnings about, hey, you go that way, it's trouble, and here's a pitfall, and here's all these things that, attitudes people have, actions, behaviors. If you want to be, you want to have friends, you got to do what?
Be friendly.
You got to be friendly. He just had all this wisdom in the realm of human relationships, human nature. John, did you have something to add?
Well, you were asking what he was knowledgeable and what wise about it. He was also knowledgeable about productivity. So all these building projects and making things and being productive, he turned his heart to that and was productive and made an increase in things and made money and did good things for the nation and for himself and for the people around about him. So it wasn't all just knowledge and things that you can't grasp, but he actually did tangible things that helped society, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Had these great building projects, engineering feats, we would say, with a lot of the things he talks about with the water pools. We had read that before. So that would have taken a lot of intelligence for all those things to do, to conceive them and get them done. Mike?
Knew about economics, he understood about wise judgments. Saw me do kind of a man that understood about everything that you had to have in order to be human.
Yeah, part of that human nature, there's a very famous thing where these two mothers come before him, these two women, that's my baby, we'll split it in half and give half to each. And he understood, no, the real mother's going to give the child up versus say, yeah, split it in half. So, all those kinds of things. You could think of political, military. We talked before, he had 700 wives. There's politics involved in 700 wives marrying, somebody from Egypt or Syria or wherever it might have been. And so he understood about politics and networking and all those kinds of things. He would have had understanding on military affairs, the academic stuff we've talked about. So he's got this huge breadth of wisdom, and he explored those things, he understood those things. So wisdom, madness and folly. What falls under madness and folly? Anything?
Well, last week
Surely we're not ignorant of madness and folly.
we associated that drinking under control and folly. So he lived in a way that he knew wasn't right, but he did it anyway to see if it would bring him happiness. So that folly of living, he did things that he knew were to be wrong, but thought, well, maybe these will bring me happiness.
Okay, you mentioned a while ago as well, productivity. That falls under wisdom. What falls under folly?
Laziness.
Laziness, exactly right. Because do we not have a prototypical picture of a beach bum that all they want to do is just hang out, have fun all day, lay around, not do anything, live off other people, live off the generosity of friends or family, and they just don't want any responsibility. And so they're lazy, irresponsible. Those kinds of things, maybe being a hippie, if you will. That kind of thing, he was like, okay, what about that? Is there contentment and happiness in life in going that route? And of course, what's the answer to that? It's vanity. Yeah, the ultimate conclusion, as we know all through here, he keeps coming back to it's vanity. Grasping for the wind. I'm going to talk about these things. Oh, it's vanity. And what about this? Well, it's vanity. What about this? Grasping for the wind. So then the latter part of verse 12, for what can the man who succeeds the king, only what he has already done. So let's think about that for a minute. When we think of Solomon as the king, and he's saying from that perspective, what can the next person do? What could they do that Solomon hadn't done? Now, they could do a little thing different, right? They could build another building. But I mean, he's already built buildings.
Did more than most. And it's going to be hard to do something with it.
Yeah, you're pretty much not going to be able to do that. There's no man other than Jesus Christ, so we'll accept him because he's outside this realm of consideration. There's no man that has lived before or after Solomon that had his wisdom. So how could anybody ever really do anything that would be better than him? That would be like, oh wow, there's something else here. As we talked about before, nothing new under the sun. That kind of thought or idea, they're just not going to be able to do it. So his son, his grandson, his great-grandsons, they're really not going to do things that are going to be radically different than what Solomon had done in his life. Now, I will say right here, there's something interesting. The New American Commentary mentions the fact that there's some textual evidence in the Hebrew, and I don't understand all that. But there's some evidence in there, in some of the ancient manuscripts, this may have reference to Adam. And if it's from that perspective, the idea is, let me ask you this. What was Adam's condition originally?
Well, he was sinless originally, and he lived in a perfect environment, and his job was to maintain that perfect environment.
Okay. What did he want? What lack was there in his reality or existence? There was none. Right? He was made perfect by the hand of God, perfect fellowship with God. So anything from there forward is downhill. And that if that's what this has reference to, we understand how that would be. Nobody's going to come after Adam and attain as a human being on earth a better state than what he had originally in the garden. But be that as it may, even when you see it at the perspective of one king followed by another king followed by another king, there's really not anything they're going to do that's different. All right, any other thoughts in verse 12? All right, verse 13, question number 1 on this lesson. Is it better to be wise or foolish? And what is the great irony in life regarding this? What does he say?
Wisdom excels folly. Well, both are going to die.
In the end, they're both going to die. So we want to understand, when we go through this book, as I said before, he's not a fatalist. And he is not saying, just be stupid all your life. That's not what he's advocating. Now, wisdom is better than folly. But look, in the end, there's really not a difference when you get down to you're going to die. You're going to face the same types of things in life, right? Whether it's natural disaster or disease or disappointment or whatever that is, that's going to happen. But verses 14 and 15, what does he say? You know, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. What does that say? Wise man's eyes are in his head. Fool walks in darkness.
It's saying that the wise man looks at where he's going and what he's doing, but the fool doesn't look ahead. He just stumbles through life from one folly to another, and usually that's a progressively downward path. And so even when he says the wisdom excels, wisdom has benefits with it. Foolishness and folly have no benefits. None.
Right. Now, there is a small degree of ignorance is bliss, where he talked about this knowledge that he had brought burden in his life. But again, he comes back to this anchor point here in verse 12, wisdom exceeds folly. You know, let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a situation where you found out bad news about a family member that they have been keeping from you, and that news hurts to hear it, but you're like, I wish you just would have told me. I just wish you would have told me about that. So that's where you gain knowledge, and it's a burden, but that's better than staying in the dark. Because then you don't understand, you don't know what's going on, you can't help out, things like that. But be that as it may, you know, the wise man sees clearly, is what he's talking about. His eyes are in his head, sees opportunities, he sees dangers, he sees the path he needs to be going down. The fool's the exact opposite. He's just stumbling around in darkness, doesn't see those opportunities. Chris?
The one who spends their life basically in folly is more apt to find trouble their whole entire life.
Yes.
And the one who tends to find wisdom can find an easier way through life as a guide, basically.
Yes. Yes, Mike.
Yeah, it's all about consequences. You know, wisdom has consequences, so does folly. Which consequences do you really want to follow under while you're going through life? In the end, you're both going to the grave. However, you're both going to have consequences, and you'd rather have those consequences. You know, if you make wise decisions, good things are going to happen. That's the consequence of making good decisions. You know, which consequences do you really want while you're going through this life?
Right, exactly right. So in verse 16, he goes on to say, you know, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, and so on. There's no remembrance of the wise or the fool. What do you think of when you see that, when you read that? Let me ask you this. What, 100 years from now, who's going to remember any of us? I seriously doubt there's very many people that will even know we existed. You know, people get lost in history. And there are certain people that stand out that most people know about. You know, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, different ones that stand out. But for the most part, people when they die, within a generation, it's like they never were around. Zach?
Kind of a random connection, but do you think that's part of the reason why our observance of the Lord's Supper is weekly? Because one argument is Jesus would never be forgotten. All the impact he had on life and on people of God. Do you think people would forget that? Well, according to Ecclesiastes, yeah, even Jesus would be forgotten. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but I wonder if that's part of if Jesus in God's wisdom is saying this is going to be a weekly observance of my death, as monumental as that is.
This do in remembrance, so we do remember him. It's specifically given for that very purpose, so that we are mindful, reminded weekly of that great sacrifice that he gave for us and looking forward to his return. But for people in this world, you know, once they're dead, it's done.
Most all of them already forgotten.
Most all of them are forgotten. Mike?
Well, you look at the pyramids, we know they're there, but we don't know how many of us could name who the pyramids, which Pharaoh actually made them for them, you know, we don't remember. Taj Mahal's kind of the same thing, it was for somebody dying, we don't know who they are.
Right.
Completely forgotten, but they've been there for thousands of years though.
Well, and a while ago, when we read in 1 Kings chapter 4, it mentioned some men, and it said, you know, Solomon's wisdom exceeds them. Who are they? You know, I mean,
John couldn't even pronounce it.
you jump forward another 1,000 years, will people like Alexander and Julius Caesar be remembered? Don't know. You know, so wise men and foolish men, in whatever impact they had in their time and their day, that fades. Death comes to all. And in verse 17, what does Solomon say? I hated life. Because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. All is vanity and grasping for the wind. His pursuit of wisdom and all the things he did, it didn't provide a protection against death. It's not going to forestall it. It's not going to prolong your life. It doesn't guarantee anything. There's no protection there, if you will. There's no guarantee with your wisdom of lasting impact on society. You know, some people, they think in their pursuit of wisdom or their pursuit of whatever field they're in, they think, I'm gonna have this great long-lasting impact. No, not really. And we would read that, and we would think, okay, that's really depressing. No matter what, you're going to die and your life doesn't mean anything. Right? Of course, we haven't gotten to the end of the book. But, you think about, let me ask you this. Why does our life have meaning and purpose? Why is it not a fatalistic view of life? Who has a fatalistic view of life in our society? What kind of people generally? There's a category of people.
People that don't know God.
People that don't know God, more specifically, atheists. Atheists, they don't see the reason for existing. They think we're just a pure accident. Everything here is just a pure accident. Well, what is it then that would give us hope or joy or meaning and purpose in our life? Don't give me Ecclesiastes 12. Let's fast forward.
Godliness with contentment is great gain.
Yes.
So we find the contentment in doing the things that God has instructed us to do.
Okay.
Commandment keepers. We're fulfilling His will.
But why do we do that?
To glorify God if we understand our purpose, because we are His creation, created in Christ Jesus unto good works that God hath before ordained.
Okay. All true. Are we going through keeping the commandments and following what's written in the New Testament for the sake of following what's written in the New Testament and keeping commandments?
I think part of the answer lies in not Ecclesiastes 12, but Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. Oh, don't go there yet? Okay.
I want to fast forward. Ron was on the trail.
also think that, us understanding that we have a finite time here
We do.
kind of forces us to get things done and to,
True.
atheists want to make their mark. We have a different purpose, and I think that's where you're trying to.
John?
To answer your question in a long answer, to gain a reward in this life is the same as trying to catch the wind, because there is no reward. Our reward is going to be eternal, and it's going to be a heavenly home. That's why he hates this life, because there is no reward here. Heaven is the reward that he's looking for and waiting for. So if we're looking for a reward here, we're grasping for the wind. If we look for the eternal reward, that's what
How are we going to get that eternal reward?
we love God and keep His commandments.
And what's that going to lead to? The resurrection. He says, look, we're all headed to death. And if that was the end of it, Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if this life only,
Yes.
we're of all men most pitiable. But the resurrection, because of Christ, because of His resurrection, guaranteeing our resurrection, that is what helps to give us meaning and purpose and hope. Hey, there's something better ahead. It's not in this life, it's in the next. And so we can look at this and say, yeah, this life, from one perspective, it stinks. Look at everything you got to go through and do. But if you have something beyond there, and a meaning and a purpose to this life, then it makes it worthwhile. It puts things in perspective. Was there something else, Ron?
I was thinking in regards to what you just said, that's where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John becomes the keystone. It completes the old, and then from Acts on, it establishes, it connects it all together. And that's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And Paul said he knows nothing other than that.
That's what that's what I'm focused on.
Yes.
That in the book of Philippians, he basically lays out the argument. That's what motivates me. That's what animates me day in and day out. That's what my life is all about. That's what our life needs to be all about. But looking back at Ecclesiastes, he says, look, I pursued wisdom and madness and folly and all these things, and where does it all end up? It ends up in death. I hated life because looking at it from that perspective, it's distressing, it's vanity, it's grasping for the wind. All right, let's read 18 to 23 now. We'll read Ecclesiastes 2, 18 to 23. Mike?
I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see.
Is that 2:18? Did I say the wrong reference?
Sorry. Zach got me chasing up. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. For I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with him. This too is vanity and great evil. For what does a man get in all of his labor and his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity.
Okay. So question 2, I'd ask, what happens to the things we accumulate in this life?
In the short term, we leave them behind when we leave this life. Everything stays here, and we go on to eternity, wherever that is. But in the long term, Peter says they're all going to be burned up. Everything in this world is going to be gone.
Right. Do you know people that their aim and purpose is to leave some type of physical, material legacy either family or business or something like that. Right? And Solomon's looking at this, everything he's done, everything he's accumulated, this kingdom over which he reigns, which is a glorious kingdom, very stable, very wealthy, and all of that. And it bothers him. I'm going to die and leave it all here. And somebody else is going to have that and control it and do what they will with it. So, you know, there's sorrow in getting these things, there's sorrow in keeping them, and there's sorrow in letting them go. Chris?
Would storing your treasures in heaven and not on earth fit this?
It most definitely fits this. Exactly right. Jesus, you know, the Sermon on the Mount echoes a lot of these things in here. You know, you need to have focus on heaven, lay up the treasures there, not things here on this earth. So you gather material things, you leave them to your children. Who do you think maybe Solomon has in mind here?
Jeroboam. Or Rehoboam.
Yeah, Rehoboam. Right? He may have already seen this in Rehoboam, and it could have been even other sons if they eventually ascend to the throne. But he could have been looking at them going, wow, this is not going to turn out good. Because, look, parents, I know sometimes parents can be blind to their children and their faults, but there are parents who have their eyes wide open, who see exactly what kind of character their children have and can judge that honestly. And I've known of parents like, he's a disaster, she's a disaster. They will look at that and take an honest assessment. And Solomon, you would understand in writing this book, this is the truth of God's Word. He's looking at the generation after him and saying, doesn't look so good. And that's a problem.
Well, I would assume that he's probably writing this after he's already been told the kingdom's coming from you. And, you know, to look at his sons like, I don't know if he's going to be wise or foolish. I do know one thing, that the kingdom's going to be torn apart. And so whether or not he's going to be wise or foolish about this, who knows what will happen. And after I'm gone, and it is what it is.
Think about the prodigal son. Right? He took his inheritance and wasted it. Just blew it. So, yeah. So, where should Christians leave their possessions? What would be wise for Christians to do? I'm going to start you off. One possibility, go to Proverbs 13. Proverbs 13 and verse 22. Proverbs 13:22. Let's read that. Who will grab that? Go ahead, Paul.
A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous.
Okay. So, a man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, so to his grandchildren. He's built up something in his life that he passes on. Would you want to pass that on to a child who's worldly, ungodly, immoral? Would you want to do that? Say you have 3 children. 2 of them are wayward. 1 of them is dedicated to the Lord. Well, it's probably a wise thing to do.
Give it to the godly child.
Here's the one who, if not gets the bulk, you know, this one gets $1, that one gets $1, and this one gets all the rest of it. And I've known of cases where Christians have done just exactly that. They put unfaithful children in a very small portion of the will, leave them very little, maybe a trinket of this or that, just a little bit of cash, but the bulk of it goes to the child who's dedicated to the Lord and to the children who are. Joyce?
Well, in that case, the fact is, the 2 that didn't get anything, they're going to have a lawsuit.
Because I've seen it happen.
Well, that's why you put, now I don't want to get into legal things, but that's why you put them in a small portion of the will. So they can't say I didn't get anything.
Well,
But
that's true, you gotta leave them something.
But the point being that if you knew your son was a prodigal son, you do not want to fund his immoral life. You want to give it to those who are going to do what's right with it. Nancy.
Well, the concept is presented in the parable of the talents. Even though that's talking about a physical thing, it's talking about being responsible with what you do and doing the right things. So it's not an unheard of concept. It's actually a godly principle.
Yes, exactly right. Parables of the talents of money, each one according to their ability. They were given certain amounts, and it showed in what they did with it, right? Let's go to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4. Let's read 34 down through 37. Acts 4, 34 through 37. We'll grab that. John.
There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold it and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to each as any had need. Thus, Joseph, who is also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet.
Okay, now, a couple of things in here. One is these people, these brethren that are being discussed, they're not dead. Joyce, this is one way you get around the problem with a will, is you do it while you're alive. They can't say a word about it, right?
As long as it's in writing.
Well, if Joyce, if you were to give me your house and give me your deed, and let's say 20 years from now you pass, I'm good to go. Your children can't say a word about that.
Can't say a word.
Right. So there's one aspect of while you have control of it, direct it toward what is good. Here, directing it toward helping needy saints, laying it at the feet of the apostles, giving it to the church. Do it. Give it. It's having lands and houses. You ever thought about that? Some of them are selling homes. Now, I don't know if this is primary home. I guess it's probably secondary homes that they're selling. They're giving those proceeds to help out the saints who are in need. You know, Christians can leave churches in their wills. I've known of some that have done that. This past year, I knew of a church down in Alabama that someone passed and left $1 million to that church. You know, that boggles our mind, but that's what we're thinking about. When Solomon's looking at, you know, I'm going to die, and, you know, the person who comes after me, I don't know if they're a wise or a fool. Well, if there's a faithful church, you have confidence in that congregation, the leadership of that congregation, that's one option. Leave it to them. Let them dispense it in the cause of the gospel versus how else it might or might not be used. Any other thoughts there? Mike?
Well, you know, I do agree that a lot of this is we're talking about physical things, but when you read specifically the beginning of Proverbs, it's talking about wisdom and how valuable it is. And, you know, it far exceeds any riches that you can have. And even says in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13, how blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding, for her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. Mm-hmm. Now, if you can gain wisdom and you can instill that into your children, what a legacy you're leaving. And that, you know, to me, I think that's more in the line of what is talked about there in Proverbs chapter 13. You know, a wise man leaves something for his grandchildren. I mean, you know, that to me is where our focus ought to be. I think that's what he's trying to turn us to in Proverbs is, you know, gaining wisdom and understanding. Even Ecclesiastes, you know,
Well, the second part of 13:22 is the wealth of sinners is stored up for the righteous. So I key in on that word. Yeah.
I don't disagree. What I'm saying is the focus, I think, of Proverbs is you can go after wealth and all that kind of stuff. It's not comparable to wisdom and understanding. That you need to be instilled in your children.
Right. And that fits right in with Ecclesiastes chapter 2 here, where he says, I labor for all these things and I've got to leave it, and who knows if the next guy's going to be wise or a fool. We work, we labor to instill wisdom in our children, and godliness is what we want to do. But just thinking about the fact that, when we're gone, it goes from our control into somebody else's control, and thinking about that ahead of time is a wise thing to be able to do, so that it's used for good as much as we can have a say in that. And as Joyce has pointed out, in our litigious society and everything, things may go awry, but let's make our best efforts at it. All right, so back to Ecclesiastes 2, and looking at verse 23, as he's discussed, I'm going to leave something behind. This is a vanity and a great evil. And verse 22, Ecclesiastes 2:22, for what has man of all his labor and striving of his heart, which he has toiled in the sand? For verse 23, for all his days are sorrowful and his work burdensome, even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. So I just asked question 3 to explain that. What's he talking about there?
The industrious person is going to work hard his whole life. He's going to lose sleep because he's thinking about how am I going to make all these things happen and be successful. The lazy man might be sleeping soundly all night long and lazing around all the day, but at the end of the life, there is no reward for all that hard work because you're dead, your life's over with, there is no more earthly accomplishments that can be had. There is no reward for all that hard work that you did your whole life. It's grasping for the wind, is what he's trying to say.
Have y'all ever heard of a case where a man either has a business or he's working in a corporate job, and it's like that is his life? And he's working, he works overtime, he's gone traveling away from his family. He misses the children's growing up years, and he's looking forward to retirement, and he retires at 60 and drops dead at 61. What did all that busyness and fury do for him? What did he sacrifice?
He had an opportunity to do something, glorify God in his life, and he didn't. He didn't bother.
Right, and family. He sacrificed that. Solomon's painting a picture here. There's somebody who's wound just too tight. Their focus is on the material, on doing these things, and they're all caught up in that. They're not really paying attention to what truly matters, what truly has value over here. Sleepless nights. And we all have sleepless nights. He's not saying, if you don't sleep soundly, there's a problem with you. He's saying there's some people that are just so intensely focused on what they're doing, they're not really getting it. And in the end, as John was saying, it's just nothing there. It's of no value. Zach?
Yeah, I think part of this perspective in verse 23 is we get lost in the weeds, the minutia of the day-to-day grind. And sometimes don't take a minute to breathe, sit down, think, what's really going on in my life? What's the big picture? And with that eternal mindset, the daily stuff really shouldn't stress us and grieve us as much as it would if we're not thinking about God and not thinking about the eternal things. We're not investing in spiritual relationships, and we're going to have sleepless nights and long days that wear us down, because it's that perspective difference between eternal versus non-eternal.
Right. Get those priorities out of whack, and we get upset about stuff and anxious about stuff we just don't need to be upset and anxious about. All right, 24 to 26. Ron, would you read Ecclesiastes 2, 24 to 26 for us?
Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind.
Okay, so I asked in question 4, does Solomon contradict himself in 2:24 where he says, look, there's nothing better than to eat and drink. Your soul should enjoy the good from your labor. Is he now coming back and saying the opposite of what he said before? And is he contradicting Jesus, as Chris mentioned a while ago, lay up treasures in heaven?
I think what he's saying is whenever you go about this grievous task of working, enjoy the fruit of the labor that you have, because you're going to die. So enjoy what you're being blessed with because of the work that you're putting in.
Any other thoughts? Zach?
This goes back to a verse Ron quoted, which is in 1 Timothy 6, verse 6. Ron quoted, but God...
Read 6 through 10 for us.
Absolutely. But godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. And if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pain.
Do you have any additional?
Not really.
Okay. Yeah. He's not coming back and saying, well, just live it up, live a life of luxury and pleasure, and be an Epicurean. And he's not saying that, because he just finished basically saying, look, there's some people, they are just wound way too tight. They don't enjoy life. But so you can enjoy what you have. It's okay. You're able to afford a home. Great. You're able to afford an automobile. Wonderful. Put food on the table and feed your family, and you have these holidays or times of celebration come along, you want to have a feast, go for it. Do it. That's perfectly fine. Just understand that's not where life is. That's not what it's all about. Chris, and then Nancy.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the fruits of labor as long as you don't let those fruits rule your life.
Right. Right, Nancy?
Well, those are the things that God has blessed us with, so we accept them as blessings. But if you disconnect that from the blessing of God, then it has no meaning at all.
Okay.
But if you connect it to God, then you can really, truly enjoy that.
All right, so 2 verse 25. Does anybody have the ESV? Go ahead. 2:25.
Or apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment?
Okay, apart from him, that's a reference to God. Okay, that 2:25 is probably saying, look, you can enjoy things, but you can't really enjoy them with a life devoid of God or divorced from God. If you have a relationship with God, then these things will be in perspective, and you can enjoy them without issues, without troubles. Paul?
That's the idea of all these things will be added unto you. Your focus needs to be.
Yeah, we need to slow down and appreciate life. Over in the book of Proverbs, he talks about a man needs to tend to his field. In fact, he says, You fix the outside, you fix your barn before you fix your house. You know, and what he's saying there is you need to take care of your business, you need to take care of how you're going to get your income before you go and start building up these things that are possessions or whatnot, right? There's a principle in there. And here, he's not saying don't labor, don't work. He's already said that folly is ridiculous. No, you can't. Wisdom is better, and wisdom says you work, you put forth effort and energy toward that, but don't let that consume you. John?
So is God through Solomon not saying here, an industrious person is going to work hard and accumulate things in his life, or her life. But it's not just going to be money, it's going to be knowledge on how to use that money. How is a godly person going to make himself happy with his belongings? Well, he's going to feed his family, he's going to take care of his family, and he's going to use that to spread the gospel. So the wisdom that's given goes along with possibly the monetary wealth that's given to further God's plan. I think it's not hidden, but I think it's obvious, should be obvious to us, that our enjoyment needs to be godly enjoyment, not our personal fleshly satisfaction.
Yes, it's not a selfish type of thing, but just to his point there, you know, when Paul was talking to the elders at Ephesus, he reminded them, you know, the Lord said it's more blessed to give than to receive. That's one way, you know, you enjoy, truly enjoy, get happiness, contentment, is doing good for others. Take care of family, bless others, spread the gospel. All right. Thank you all very much. Lord willing, we'll jump into chapter 3 next week.